Right, I'm sorry about that, everyone. My internet, for some reason, cut out there. Stupid thing. Oh, yeah, that old Bud Ice TV commercial that I remember from the 90s. Still remember it. My mum was saying about it. I thought I'd play it for her. Still funny. Anyway, um, I'll wait until everybody comes back. Yeah, flaming internet cut out, and it ended the live stream. I hate it when that happens. Um, I'll go to where I left off. When I first beheld this apparition. Excuse me. All right. I'll continue reading. It's great. Because of that, I've lost some of the viewers. Oh well. When I first beheld this apparition, for I could scarcely regard it as less, my wonder and my terror were extreme. But at length reflection came to my aid. The cat, I remembered, had been hung in a garden adjacent to the house. Upon the alarm of fire, this garden had been immediately filled by the crowd, by someone of whom the animal must have been cut from the tree and thrown through an open window into my chamber. This had probably been done with a view of arousing me from sleep. The falling of other walls had compressed the victim of my cruelty into the substance of the freshly spread plaster, the lime of which, with the flames and the ammonia from the carcass, had then accomplished the portraiture as I saw it. Although I thus readily accounted to my reason, if not altogether to my conscience, for the startling fact just detailed, it did not the less fail to make a deep impression upon my fancy. For months I could not rid myself of the phantasm of the cat, and during this period there came back into my spirit a half sentiment that seemed, but was not, remorse. I went so far as to regret the loss of the animal, and to look about me among the vile haunts which I now habitually frequented for another pet of the same species, and of somewhat similar appearance, with which to supply its place. One night, as I sat, half stupefied in a den of more than infamy, my attention was suddenly drawn to some black object, reposing upon the head of one of the immense hogsheads of gin or of rum, which constituted the chief furniture of the apartment. I had been looking steadily at the top of this hogshead for some minutes, and what now caused me surprise was the fact that I had not sooner perceived the object thereupon. "Hi, Rabid Mouse. Happy you've joined." I approached it and touched it with my hand. It was a black cat, a very large one, fully as large as Pluto, and closely resembling him in every respect but one. Pluto had not a white hair upon any portion of his body, but this cat had a large, although indefinite, splotch of white, covering nearly the whole region of the breast. "Hi, Aaron. Happy you've joined as well." Upon my touching him, he immediately arose, purred loudly, rubbed against my hand, and appeared delighted with my notice. This, then, was the very creature of which I was in search. I at once offered to purchase it of the landlord, but this person made no claim to it, knew nothing of it, had never seen it before. I continued my caresses, and when I prepared to go home, the animal evinced a disposition to accompany me. I permitted it to do so, occasionally stooping and patting it as I proceeded. When it reached the house, it domesticated itself at once and became immediately a great favourite with my wife. "Hi, Kimberly." For my own part, I soon found a dislike to it arising within me. This was just the reverse of what I had anticipated, but I know not how or why it was. Its evident fondness for myself rather disgusted and annoyed. By slow degrees, these feelings of disgust and annoyance rose into the bitterness of hatred. I avoided the creature, a certain sense of shame, and the remembrance of my former deed of cruelty, preventing me from physically abusing it. I did not, for some weeks, strike or otherwise violently ill-use it, but gradually, very gradually, I came to look upon it with unutterable loathing, and to flee silently from its odious presence as from the breath of a pestilence. What added, no doubt, to my hatred of the beast was the discovery on the morning after I brought it home that, like Pluto, it also had been deprived of one of its eyes. This circumstance, however, only endeared to my wife, who, as I have already said, possessed, in a high degree, that humanity of feeling which had once been my distinguishing trait, and the source of many of my simplest and purest pleasures. With my aversion to this cat, however, its partiality for myself seemed to increase. It followed my footsteps with a pertinacity which it would be difficult to make the reader comprehend. Whenever I sat, it would crouch beneath my chair or spring upon my knees, covering me with its loathsome caresses. If I arose to walk, it would get between my feet and thus nearly throw me down, or, fastening its long and sharp claws in my dress, clamber in this manner to my breast. At such times, although I longed to destroy it with a blow, I was yet withheld from so doing, partly by a memory of my former crime, but chiefly, let me confess it at once, my absolute dread of the beast. This dread was not exactly a dread of physical evil, and yet I should be at a loss how otherwise to define it. I am almost ashamed to own, yes, even in this felon's cell, I am almost ashamed to own that the terror and horror with which the animal inspired me had been heightened by one of the merest chimeras it would be possible to conceive. My wife had called my attention more than once to the character of the mark of white hair of which I have spoken, and which constituted the sole visible difference between the strange beast and the one I had destroyed. The reader will remember that this mark, although large, had been originally very indefinite, but by slow degrees nearly imperceptible, and which for a long time my reason struggled to reject as fanciful, it had at length assumed a rigorous distinctness of outline. It was now the representation of an object that I shudder to name, and for this, above all, I loathed and dreaded, and would have rid myself of the monster had I dared. It was now, I say, the image of a hideous, of a ghastly thing, of the gallows. Oh, the mournful and terrible engine of horror and crime, of agony and of death! And now was I indeed wretched beyond the wretchedness of mere humanity, and a brute beast whose fellow I had contemptuously destroyed, a brute beast to work out for me a man fashioned in the image of the high God, so much of insufferable woe. Alas, neither by day nor by night knew I the blessing of rest any more. During the form of the creature left me no moment alone, and in the latter I started, hourly, from dreams of unutterable fear, to find the hot breath of the thing upon my face, and its vast weight, an incarnate nightmare that I had no power to shake off, incumbent eternally upon my heart. Beneath the pressure of torments such as these, the feeble remnant of the good within me succumbed. Evil thoughts became my sole intimates, the darkest and most evil of thoughts. The moodiness of my usual temper increased hatred of all things and of all mankind, while from the sudden, frequent and ungovernable outbursts of a fury to which I now blindly abandoned myself, my uncomplaining wife, alas, was the most usual and the most patient of sufferers. One day she accompanied me upon some household errand into the cellar of the old building which our poverty compelled us to inhabit. The cat followed me down the steep stairs, and, nearly throwing me headlong, exasperated me to madness. Uplifting an axe, and forgetting, in my wrath, the childish dread which had hitherto stayed my hand, I aimed a blow at the animal, which of course would have proved instantly fatal had it descended as I wished. But this blow was arrested by the hand of my wife. goaded by the interference into a rage more than demoniacal, I withdrew my arm from her grasp and buried the axe in her brain. She fell dead upon the spot without a groan. Hi, CDC. Hinsdale. And thank you, Dr. Fell. This hideous murder accomplished, I set myself forthwith and with entire deliberation to the task of concealing the body. I knew that I could not remove it from the house, either by day or by night, without the risk of being observed by the neighbours. Many projects entered my mind. At one period I thought of cutting the corpse into minute fragments and destroying them by fire. At another, I resolved to dig a grave for it in the floor of the cellar. Again, I deliberated about casting it in the well in the yard, about packing it in a box, as if merchandise, with the usual arrangements, and so getting a porter to take it from the house. Finally, I hit upon what I considered a far better expedient than either of these. I determined to wall it up in the cellar, as the monks of the Middle Ages are recorded to have walled up their victims. For a purpose such as this, the cellar was well adapted. Its walls were loosely constructed, and had lately been plastered throughout with a rough plaster, which the dampness of the atmosphere had prevented from hardening. Moreover, in one of the walls was a projection caused by a false chimney or fireplace that had been filled up and made to resemble the rest of the cellar. I made no doubt that I could readily displace the bricks at this point, insert the corpse, and wall the whole up as before, so that no eye could detect anything suspicious. And in this calculation I was not deceived. By means of a crowbar I easily dislodged the bricks, and having carefully deposited the body against the inner wall, I propped it in that position, while with little trouble I relaid the whole structure as it originally stood. Having procured mortar, sand, and hair with every possible precaution, I prepared a plaster which could not be distinguished from the old, and with this I very carefully went over the new brickwork. When I had finished, I felt satisfied that all was right. The wall did not present the slightest appearance of having been disturbed. The rubbish on the floor was picked up with the minutest care. I looked around triumphantly and said to myself, "Here at least then my labour had not been in vain." My next step was to look for the beast which had been the cause of so much wretchedness, for I had, at length, firmly resolved to put it to death. Had I been able to meet with it at the moment, there could have been no doubt of its fate, but it appeared that the crafty animal had been alarmed at the violence of my previous anger, and forbore to present itself in my present mood. It is impossible to describe or to imagine the blissful sense of relief which the absence of the detested creature occasioned in my bosom. It did not make its appearance during the night, and thus for one night at least, since its introduction into the house, I soundly and tranquilly slept. I slept even with the burden of murder upon my soul. The second and the third day passed, and still my tormentor came not. Once again I breathed as a freeman. The monster, in terror, had fled the premises forever. I should behold it no more. My happiness was supreme. The guilt of my dark deed disturbed me but little. Some few inquiries had been made, but these had been readily answered. Even a search had been instituted, but of course nothing was to be discovered. I looked upon my future felicity as secured. Upon the fourth day of the assassination, a party of the police came, very unexpectedly, into the house, and proceeded again to make rigorous investigation of the premises. Secure, however, in the inscrutability of my place of concealment, I felt no embarrassment whatever. The officers bade me accompany them in their search. They left no nook or corner unexplored. At length, for the third or fourth time, they descended into the cellar. I quivered not in a muscle. My heart beat calmly as that of one who slumbers in innocence. I walked the cellar from end to end. I folded my arms upon my bosom, and roamed easily to and fro. The police were thoroughly satisfied and prepared to depart. The glee at my heart was too strong to be restrained. I burned to say, if but one word, by way of triumph, and to render doubly sure their assurance of my guiltlessness. "Gentlemen," I said at last, as the party ascended the steps, "I delight to have allayed your suspicions. I wish you all health, and a little more courtesy. By the by, gentlemen, this is a very well constructed house." In the rabid desire to say something easily, I scarcely knew what I uttered at all. I may say an excellently well constructed house. These walls, are you going, gentlemen? These walls are solidly put together, and here, through the mere frenzy of bravado, I rapped heavily, with a crane which I held in my hand, upon that very portion of the brickwork behind which stood the corpse of the wife of my bosom. But may God shield and deliver me from the fangs of the arch-fiend. No sooner had the reverberation of my blows sunk into silence than I was answered by a voice from within the tomb, by a cry at first muffled and broken, like the sobbing of a child, and then quickly swelling into one long, loud and continuous scream, utterly anomalous and inhuman, a howl, a wailing shriek, half of horror and half of triumph, such as might have arisen only out of hell, conjointly from the throats of the damned in their agony, and of the demons that exult in the damnation. Of my own thoughts it is folly to speak. Swooning, I staggered to the opposite wall. For one instant the party upon the stairs remained motionless, through extremity of terror and of awe. In the next, a dozen stout arms were toiling at the wall. It fell bodily. The corpse, already greatly decayed and clotted with gore, stood erect before the eyes of the spectators. Upon its head, with red extended mouth and solitary eye of fire, sat the hideous beast whose craft had seduced me into murder, and whose informing voice had consigned me to the hangman. I had walled the monster up within the tomb. Alright, that's the end. And I know there was a different story. I think, was it Mary or Betty Bam Bam suggested for me to read next? Thank you. Thank you. Rabid Desire. Oh, yeah. Yes, it's part of your name. Just a moment, everyone. I'm just going to have myself a little bit of chocolate. Alright, I'm back. Okay then, The Raven. Alrighty. Let's go. Oh, take care, Kimberly. Thank you so much for coming. The Raven, by Edgar Allan Poe. Once upon a midnight dreary, while I pondered, weak and weary, over many a quaint and curious volume of forgotten lore. While I nodded, nearly napping, suddenly there came a tapping, as of someone gently rapping at my chamber door. "'Tis some visitor," I muttered, tapping at my chamber door, only this and nothing more. Ah, distinctly I remember it was in the bleak December, and each separate dying ember wrought its ghost upon the floor. Eagerly I wished the morrow, vainly I had sought to borrow from my books surcease of sorrow, sorrow for the lost Lenore, for the rare and radiant maiden whom the angels name Lenore, nameless here for evermore. And the silken, sad, uncertain rustling of each purple curtain thrilled me, filled me with fantastic terrors never felt before, so that now, to still the beating of my heart, I stood repeating, "'Tis some visitor entreating entrance at my chamber door, some late visitor entreating entrance at my chamber door. This is it and nothing more." Presently my soul grew stronger, hesitating then no longer. "Sir," said I, "or madam, truly your forgiveness I implore. But the fact is I was napping, and so gently you came rapping, and so faintly you came tapping, tapping at my chamber door, that I scarce was sure I heard you. Here I opened wide the door. Darkness there and nothing more. Deep into that darkness peering, long I stood there wondering, fearing, doubting, dreaming dreams no mortal ever dared to dream before. But the silence was unbroken, and the stillness gave no token, and the only word there spoken was the whispered word, "Lenore?" This I whispered, and an echo murmured back the word, "Lenore," merely this and nothing more. Back into the chamber turning, all my soul within me burning, soon again I heard a tapping somewhat louder than before. "Surely," said I, "surely that is something at my window lattice. Let me see then what the rite is, and this mystery explore. Let my heart be still a moment and this mystery explore. 'Tis the wind and nothing more." Open here I flung the shutter, when with many a flirt and flutter, in there stepped a stately raven of the saintly days of yore. Not the least obeisance made he, not a minute stopped or stayed he, but with mien of lord or lady, perched above my chamber door, perched upon a bust of Pallas, just above my chamber door, perched and sat, and nothing more. Then this ebony bird, beguiling my sad fancy into smiling. I'm just going to check with that word, beguiling, or whatever it's pronounced. Just a moment. No, I did say that correctly. Okay. Then this ebony bird, beguiling my sad fancy into smiling, by the grave and stern decorum of the countenance it wore. "Though thy crest be shorn and shaven, thou," I said, "art sure no craven, ghastly grim and ancient raven wandering from the nightly shore. Tell me what thy lordly name is on the night's Plutonian shore." Quoth the raven, "Nevermore." "Hi, Walter, Texas. Thank you for coming." Much I marvelled this ungainly fowl to hear discourse so plainly, though its answer little meaning, little relevancy bore. For we cannot help agreeing that no living human being ever yet was blessed with seeing bird above his chamber door, bird or beast upon the sculptured bust above his chamber door, with such name as Nevermore. But the raven, sitting lonely on the placid bust, spoke only that one word, as if his soul in that one would he did outpour. Nothing farther than he uttered, not a feather than he fluttered, till I scarcely more than muttered, "Other friends have flown before, on the morrow he will leave me, as my hopes have flown before." Then the bird said, "Nevermore." Startled at the stillness broken by reply so aptly spoken, "Doubtless," said I, "what it utters is its only stock and store, caught from some unhappy master, whom unmerciful disaster..." Oh, thank you for subscribing, KDA Scambates. Startled at the stillness broken by reply so aptly spoken, "Doubtless," said I, "what it utters is its only stock and store, caught from some unhappy master, whom unmerciful disaster..." followed fast and followed faster, till his songs one burden bore, till the dirges of his hope that melancholy burden bore of never, nevermore. I can't remember how that word melancholy is actually pronounced. Melancholy burden before of never, nevermore. But the raven, still beguiling all my fancy into smiling, straight I wheeled a cushioned seat in front of bird and bust and door. Then upon the velvet sinking, I betook myself into linking fancy unto fancy, thinking what this ominous bird of yore, what this grim, ungainly, ghastly, gaunt, and ominous bird of yore meant in croaking nevermore. This I sat engaged in guessing, but no syllable expressing, to the fowl whose fiery eyes now burned into my bosom's core. This and more I sat divining, with my head at ease reclining on the cushion's velvet lining that the lamplight gloated o'er, but whose velvet violet lining with the lamplight gloating o'er she shall press, nevermore. Then methought the air grew denser, perfumed from an unseen censer, swung by seraphim whose footfalls tinkled on the tufted floor. Wretch, I cried, thy God hath lent thee, by these angels he hath sent thee respite, and nepenthe from nepenthe from thy memories of Lenore. Quaff, oh quaff, this kind nepenthe, and forget this lost Lenore. Quoth the raven, nevermore. Dr. Fell. We shall see, but you shall not get any, nevermore, Dr. Fell. Prophet, said I, thing of evil, prophet still, if bird or devil, whether tempter sent, or whether tempest tossed thee here ashore, desolate, yet all undaunted, on this desert land enchanted, on this home by horror haunted, tell me truly, I implore, is there balm in Gilead? In Gilead, tell me, I implore. Quoth the raven, nevermore. Prophet, said I, thing of evil, prophet still, if bird or devil, by that heaven that bends above us, by that God we both adore, tell this soul with sorrow ladeneth within the distant Eden, it shall clasp a sainted maiden whom the angels name Lenore, clasp a rare and radiant maiden whom the angels name Lenore. Quoth the raven, nevermore. Be that word our sign of parting, bird or fiend, I shrieked, upstarting, get thee back into the tempest and the night's Plutonian shore. Leave no black plume as a token of that lie thy soul hath spoken. Leave my loneliness unbroken. Quit the bust above my door. Take thy beak from out my heart, and take thy form from off my door. Quoth the raven, nevermore. And the raven, never flitting, still is sitting on the pallid bust of Pallas just above my chamber door, and his eyes have all the seeming of a demon's that is dreaming, and the lamp light o'er him streaming throws his shadow on the floor, and my soul from out that shadow that lies floating on the floor shall be lifted nevermore. The end. Right. Any other stories you'd like me to read out? Thank you. Thank you. You're very welcome. Oh, and the fruit monster. Thank you all to Texas. Right, let's see. There's a thing at the bottom of the well. See if I can find that story. Dillhole and the Spider Galaxy. Some stories where they're just not available to read online. Oh yeah, really fantastic stories by Edgar Allan Poe and Stephen King. Let's look if there are any more, any good other stories by Edgar Allan Poe. Any other stories you recommend me? Oh, okay. Telltale Heart. I shall read that. Come on. Thank you. Okay. The Telltale Heart. True, nervous, very, very dreadfully nervous. I had been and am. But why will you say that I am mad? The disease had sharpened my senses, not destroyed, not dulled them. Above all was the sense of hearing acute. I heard all things in the heaven and in the earth. I heard many things in hell. How then am I mad? Hearken and observe how healthily, how calmly I can tell you the whole story. It is impossible to say how first the idea entered my brain, but once conceived, it haunted me day and night. Object there was none. Passion there was none. I loved the old man. He had never wronged me. He had never given me insult. For his gold I had no desire. I think it was his eye. Yes, it was this. One of his eyes resembled that of a vulture, a pale blue eye with a film over it. Whenever it fell upon me, my blood ran cold, and so by degrees, very gradually, I made up my mind to take the life of the old man, and thus rid myself of the eye forever. A thunderstorm? Okay, I can do that along with the music. Just a moment. I'll let the music continue playing. Is this alright with the one where it has rain in it? Alright then. Is this is the volume okay? Please let me know. Yeah, do so, Rabbit Mouse. Go ahead. Make yourself all comfortable while I read this story with the thunder and lightning and eerie music playing in the background. Louder storm. You want me to turn it up louder? Okay. Okay. Now this is the point. You fancy me mad. Madmen know nothing. But you should have seen me. You should have seen how wisely I proceeded. With what caution, with what foresight, with what dissimulation I went to work. I was never kinder to the old man than during the whole week before I killed him, and every night about midnight I turned the latch of his door and opened it, oh so gently, and then when I had made an opening sufficient for my head, I put in a dark lantern, all closed, so that no light shone out, and then I thrust in my head. Oh, you would have laughed to see how cunningly I thrust it in. I moved it slowly, very, very slowly, so that I might not disturb the old man's sleep. It took me an hour to place my whole head within the opening so far that I could see him as he lay upon his bed. Ha! Would a madman have been so wise as this? And then when my head was well in the room, I undid the lantern cautiously. Oh, so cautiously, cautiously, for the hinges creaked. I undid it just so much that a single thin ray fell upon the vulture eye. And this I did for 7 long nights, every night just at midnight. But I found the eye always closed, and so it was impossible to do the work, for it was not the old man who vexed me, but his evil eye. And every morning, when the day broke, I went boldly into the chamber and spoke courageously to him, calling him by name in a hearty tone, and inquiring how he had passed the night. So you see he would have been a very profound old man, indeed, to suspect that every night, just at 12, I looked in upon him while he slept. Upon the 8th night I was more than usually cautious in opening the door. A watch's minute hand moves more quickly than did mine. Never before that night I felt the extent of my own powers, of my sagacity. I could scarcely contain my feelings of triumph. To think that there I was, opening the door, little by little, and he not even to dream of my secret deeds or thoughts. I fairly chuckled at the idea, and perhaps he heard me, for he moved on the bed suddenly, as if startled. Now you may think that I drew back, but no. His room was as black as pitch with the thick darkness, for the shutters were close fastened, through fear of robbers. And so I knew that he could not see the opening of the door, and I kept pushing it on steadily, steadily. I had my head in, and was about to open the lantern, when my thumb slipped upon the tin fastening, and the old man sprang up in the bed, crying out, "Who's there?" I kept quite still and said nothing. For a whole hour I did not move a muscle, and in the meantime I did not hear him lie down. He was still sitting up in the bed listening, just as I have done night after night, hearkening to the death watches in the wall. Presently I heard a slight groan, and I knew it was the groan of mortal terror. It was not a groan of pain or of grief. Oh no, it was the low stifled sound that arises from the bottom of the soul when overcharged with awe. I knew the sound well. Many a night, just at midnight, when all the world slept, it has welled up from my own bosom, deepening with its dreadful echo the terrors that distracted me. I say I knew it well. I knew what the old man felt, and pitied him, although I chuckled at heart. I knew that he had been lying awake ever since the first slight noise, when he had turned in the bed. His fears had been ever since growing upon him. He had been trying to fancy them causeless, but could not. He had been saying to himself, "It is nothing but the wind in the chimney. It is only a mouse crossing the floor, or it is merely a cricket which has made a single chirp." Yes, he has been trying to comfort himself with these suppositions. But he had found all in vain, because death, in approaching him, had stalked with his black shadow before him and enveloped the victim. And it was the mournful influence of the unperceived shadow that caused him to feel, although he neither saw nor heard, to feel the presence of my head within the room. When I had waited a long time, very patiently, without hearing him lie down, I resolved to open a very, very little crevice in the lantern. So I opened it. You cannot imagine how stealthily, until at length a single dim ray, like the thread of the spider, shot from out the crevice and fell upon the vulture eye. It was open, wide open, and I grew furious as I gazed upon it. I saw it with perfect distinctness, all a dull blue, with a hideous veil over it that chilled the very marrow in my bones. But I could see nothing else of the old man's face or person, for I had directed the ray as if by instinct precisely upon the damned spot. And now have I not told you that what you mistake for madness is but over acuteness of the senses? Now I say, there came to my ears a low, dull, quick sound, such as a watch makes when enveloped in cotton. I knew that sound well too. It was the beating of the old man's heart. It increased my fury, as the beating of a drum stimulates the soldier into courage. But even yet I refrained and kept still. I scarcely breathed. I held the lantern motionless. I tried how steadily I could maintain the ray upon the eye. Meantime the hellish tattoo of the heart increased. It grew quicker and quicker, louder and louder every instant. The old man's terror must have been extreme. It grew louder, I say louder, every moment. Do you mark me well? I have told you that I am nervous, so I am. And now at the dead hour of the night, amid the dreadful silence of that old house, so strange a noise as this excited me to uncontrollable terror. Yet for some minutes longer I refrained and stood still. But the beating grew louder. I thought the heart must burst. And now a new anxiety seized me. The sound would be heard by a neighbour. The old man's hour had come. With a loud yell, I threw open the lantern and leaped into the room. He shrieked once only. In an instant I dragged him to the floor and pulled the heavy bed over him. I then smiled gaily to find the deed so far done. But for many minutes the heart beat on with a muffled sound. This, however, did not vex me. It would not be heard through the wall. At length it ceased. The old man was dead. I removed the bed and examined the corpse. Yes, he was stone dead. I placed my hand upon the heart and held it there many minutes. There was no pulsation. He was stone dead. His eye would trouble me no more. If still you think me mad, you will think so no longer when I describe the wise precautions I took for the concealment of the body. The night waned, and I worked hastily, but in silence. First of all, I dismembered the corpse. I cut off the head and the arms and the legs. I then took up 3 planks from the flooring of the chamber and deposited all between the scandalings. I then replaced the boards so cleverly, so cunningly, that no human eye, not even his, could have detected anything wrong. There was nothing to wash out, no stain of any kind, no blood spot whatever. I had been too wary of that. A tub had caught all. Ha ha! Stoned Water, Texas. When I had made an end of these labours, it was 4 o'clock, still dark as midnight. As the bell sounded the hour, there came a knocking at the street door. I went down to open it with a light heart, for what had I now to fear? There entered 3 men who introduced themselves with perfect suavity as officers of the police. A shriek had been heard by a neighbour during the night. Suspicion of foul play had been aroused. Information had been lodged at the police office, and they, the officers, had been deputed to search the premises. I smiled, for what I had to fear. I bade the gentleman welcome. The shriek, I said, was my own in a dream. The old man I mentioned was absent in the country. I took my visitors all over the house. I bade them search well. I led them at length to his chamber. I showed them his treasures, secure, undisturbed. In the enthusiasm of my confidence, I brought chairs into the room and desired them here to rest from their fatigues, while I myself, in the wild audacity of my perfect triumph, placed my own seat upon the very spot beneath which reposed the corpse of the victim. The officers were satisfied. My manner had convinced them. I was singularly at ease. They sat, and while I answered cheerily, they chatted of familiar things. But ere long I felt myself getting pale and wished them gone. My head ached, and I fancied a ringing in my ears, but still they sat and still chatted. The ringing became more extinct. It continued and became more distinct. I talked more freely to get rid of the feeling, but it continued and gained definitiveness, until at length I found that the noise was not within my ears. No doubt I grew very pale, but I talked more fluently, and with a heightened voice, yet the sound increased, and what could I do? It was a low, dull, quick sound, much sounder sound as a watch makes when enveloped in cotton. I gasped for breath, and yet the officers heard it not. I talked more quickly, more vehemently, but the noise steadily increased. I arose and argued about trifles in a high key and with violent gesticulations, but the noise steadily increased. Why would they not be gone? I paced the floor to and fro with heavy strides, as if excited to fury by the observations of the men, but the noise steadily increased. Oh God, what could I do? I foamed, I raved, I swore. I swung the chair upon which I had been sitting and grated it upon the boards, but the noise arose over all and continually increased. It grew louder, 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 and still the men chatted pleasantly and smiled. Was it possible they heard not? Almighty God, no, no. They heard, they suspected, they knew. They were making a mockery of my horror. This I thought, and this I think. But anything was better than this agony. Anything was more tolerable than this derision. I could bear those hypocritical smiles no longer. I felt that I must scream or die, and now, again, hark, louder, 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 louder! Villains, I shrieked, dissemble no more. I admit the deed. Tear up the planks. Here, here. It is the beating of his hideous heart. The end. Hi Ichiro. Yes. Halloween themed. Thank you for coming, by the way. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Ah, you were sleeping. Long work night. Oops. I'll see what other stories I could read next. Let's see. Okay, I think. What do you think I should read next? I got away cookies. The premature burial? Just looking for good ones. Any ones you recommend me, anyone? Hi, Deborah. The Adventures. Dillhole's left hand. Alright, I'll find something. Sorry, everyone. I'll just get on with it. Alright then. Thank you. Okay, I'll do this one. So that you, none of you keep on waiting. Right. The Mask of the Red Death by Edgar Allan Poe. Published 1850. The Red Death had long devastated the country. No pestilence had ever been so fatal or so hideous. Blood was its avatar and its seal. The redness and the horror of blood. There were sharp pains and sudden dizziness, and then profuse bleeding at the pores, with disillusion. The scarlet stains upon the body, and especially upon the face of the victim, were the pest ban which shut him out from the aid and from the sympathy of his fellow men, and the whole seizure, progress and termination of the disease were the incidents of half an hour, but the Prince Prospero was happy and dauntless and sagacious. When his dominions were half depopulated, he summoned to his presence 1,000 hale and light-hearted friends from among the knights and dames of his court, and with these retired to the deep seclusion of one of his castellated abbeys. This was an extensive and magnificent structure, the creation of the prince's own eccentric yet august taste. A strong and lofty wall girdled it in. This wall had gates of iron. The courtiers, having entered, brought furnaces and massy hammers and welded the bolts. They resolved to leave means neither of ingress or egress to the sudden impulses of despair or of frenzy from within. The abbey was amply provisioned with such precautions the courtiers might bid defiance to contagion. The external world could take care of itself. In the meantime, it was folly to grieve or to think. The prince had provided all the appliances of pleasure. There were buffoons, there were improvisatori, there were ballet dancers, there were musicians, there was beauty, there was wine. All these and security were within. Without was the Red Death. It was toward the close of the 5th or 6th month of his seclusion, and while the pestilence raged most furiously abroad, that the Prince Prospero entertained his 1,000 friends at a masked ball of the most unusual magnificence. It was a voluptuous scene, that masquerade. But first let me tell of the rooms in which it was held. There were 7, an imperial suite. In many palaces, however, such suites form a long and straight vista, while the folding doors slide back nearly to the walls on either hand, so that the view of the whole extent is scarcely impeded. Here the case was very different, as might have been expected from the Duke's love of the bizarre. The apartments were so irregularly disposed that the vision embraced but little more than one at a time. There was a sharp turn at every 20 or 30 yards, and at each turn a novel effect. To the right and left, in the middle of each wall, a tall and narrow Gothic window looked out upon a closed corridor which pursued the windings of the suite. These windows were of stained glass whose colour varied in accordance with the prevailing hue of the decorations of the chamber into which it opened. That at the eastern extremity was hung, for example, in blue, and vividly blue were its windows. The second chamber was purple in its ornaments and tapestries, and here the panes were purple. The third was green throughout, and so were the casements. The fourth was furnished and lighted with orange, the fifth with white, the sixth with violet. The 7th apartment was closely shrouded in black velvet tapestries that hung all over the ceiling and down the walls, falling in heavy folds upon a carpet of the same material and hue. But in this chamber only, the colour of the windows failed to correspond with the decorations. The panes here were scarlet, a deep blood colour. Now in no one of the 7 apartments was there any lamp or candelabrum. Amid the profusion of golden ornaments that lay scattered to and fro or depended from the roof. There was no light of any kind emanating from lamp or candle within the suite of chambers. But in the corridors that followed the suite there stood, opposite to each window, a heavy tripod bearing a brazier of fire that projected its rays through the tinted glass and so glaringly illumined the room. Just a moment, I'm checking. Illumined. Okay. And illumined the room, and thus were produced a multitude of gaudy and fantastic appearances. But in the western or black chamber, the effect of the firelight that streamed upon the dark hangings through the blood-tinted panes was ghastly in the extreme, and produced so wild a look upon the countenances of those who entered, that there were few of the company bold enough to set foot within its precincts at all. It was in this apartment also that there stood against the western wall a gigantic clock of ebony. Its pendulum swung to and fro with a dull, heavy, monotonous clang, and when the minute hand made the circuit of the face and the hour was to be stricken, there came from the brazen lungs of the clock a sound which was clear and loud and deep and exceedingly musical, but of so peculiar a note and emphasis that at each lapse of an hour the musicians of the orchestra were constrained to pause momentarily in their performance to hearken to the sound, and thus the waltzers perforce ceased their evolutions, and there was a brief disconcert of the whole gay company, and while the chimes of the clock yet rang, it was observed that the giddiest grew pale, and the more aged and sedate passed their hands over their brows, as if in confused reverie or meditation. But when the echoes had fully ceased, a light laughter at once pervaded the assembly. The musicians looked at each other and smiled as if at their own nervousness and folly, and made whispering vows, each to the other, that the next chiming of the clock should produce in them no similar emotion. And then, after the lapse of 60 minutes, which embraced 3,600 seconds of the time that flies, there came yet another chiming of the clock, and there were the same disconcert and tremulousness and meditation as before. But in spite of these things, it was a gay and magnificent revel. The tastes of the Duke were peculiar. He had a fine eye for colours and effects. He disregarded the decor of mere fashion. His plans were bold and fiery, and his conceptions glowed with barbaric lustre. There are some who would have thought him mad. His followers felt that he was not. It was necessary to hear and see and touch him to be sure that he was not. He had directed in great part the movable embellishments of the 7 chambers upon occasion of this great fete, and it was his own guiding taste which had given character to the masqueraders, Be sure they were grotesque. There were much glare and glitter and piquancy and phantasm. Much of what has been since in Hernani. There were arabesque figures with unsuited limbs and appointments. There were delirious fancies such as the madman fashions. There were much of the beautiful, much of the wanton, much of the bizarre, something of the terrible, and not a little of that which might have excited disgust. To and fro in the 7 chambers there stalked, in fact, a multitude of dreams. And these, the dreams, writhed in and about, taking hue from the rooms, and causing the wild music of the orchestra to seem as the echo of their steps, and anon there strikes the ebony clock which stands in the hall of the velvet, and then for a moment all is still, and all is silent save the voice of the clock. The dreams are stiff frozen as they stand, but the echoes of the chime die away. They have endured but an instant, and a light, half-subdued laughter floats after them as they depart. And now again the music swells, and the dreams live, and writhe to and fro more merrily than ever, taking hue from the many-tinted windows through which stream the rays from the tripods. But to the chamber which lies most westwardly of the 7, there are now none of the maskers who venture, for the night is waning away. And there flows a ruddier light through the blood-coloured panes, and the blackness of the sable drapery appalls. And to him whose foot falls upon the sable carpet, there comes from the near clock of ebony a muffled peal more solemnly emphatic than any which reaches their ears who indulge in the more remote gaieties of the other apartments. Rabbit mouse. Hi, Pecan Head. Sonic, will you read Green Eggs and Ham for Dillhole? Oh, goodness, Dillhole. No, I don't think so, Pecan Head, no. But these other apartments were densely crowded, and in them beat feverishly in the heart of life, and the revel went wearingly on, until at length there commenced the sounding of midnight upon the clock, and then the music ceased, as I have told, and the evolutions of the waltzers were quieted, and there was an uneasy cessation of all things as before. Oh, what's that? Oh, thank you for subscribing, Pecan Head. Just a moment, everyone. There we go. But now there were 12 strokes to be sounded by the bell of the clock, and thus it happened, perhaps, that more of thought crept with more of time into the meditations of the thoughtful among those who revelled. And thus too it happened, perhaps, that before the last echoes of the last chime had utterly sunk into silence, there were many individuals in the crowd who had found leisure to become aware of the presence of a masked figure which had arrested the attention of no single individual before, and the rumour of this new presence having spread itself whisperingly around, there arose at length from the whole company a buzz or murmur expressive of disapprobation, and surprise, then finally of terror, of horror, and of disgust. In an assembly of phantasms such as I have painted, it may well be supposed that no ordinary appearance could have excited such sensation. In truth, the masquerade license of the night was nearly unlimited, but the figure in question had out-Heroded Herod, had gone beyond the bounds of even the prince's indefinite decorum. There are chords in the hearts of the most reckless which cannot be touched without emotion. Even with the utterly lost, to whom life and death are equally jests, there are matters of which no jest can be made. The whole company, indeed, seemed now deeply to feel that in the costume and bearing of the stranger neither wit nor propriety existed. The figure was tall and gaunt, and shrouded from head to foot in the habiliments of the grave. The mask which concealed the visage was made so nearly to resemble the countenance of a stiffened corpse that the closest scrutiny must have had difficulty in detecting the cheat. And yet all this might have been endured, if not approved, by the mad revellers around, but the mummer had gone so far as to assume the type of the Red Death. This vesture was dabbled in blood, and his broad brow, with all the features of the face, was besprinkled with scarlet horror. When the eyes of Prince Prospero fell upon this spectral image, which, with a slow and solemn movement, as if more fully to sustain its role, stalked to and fro among the waltzers, he was seen to be convulsed in the first moment with a strong shudder either of terror or distaste, but in the next his brow reddened with rage. "Who dares," he demanded hoarsely of the courtiers who stood near him, "who dares insult us with this blasphemous mockery? Seize him and unmask him, that we may know whom we have to hang at sunrise from the battlements." It was in the eastern or blue chamber in which stood the Prince Prospero as he uttered these words. They rang throughout the 7 rooms loudly and clearly, for the prince, who was a bold and robust man, and the music had become hushed at the waving of his hand. It was in the blue room where stood the prince, with a group of pale courtiers by his side. At first, as he spoke, there was a slight rushing movement of this group in the direction of the intruder, who at the moment was also near at hand, and now with deliberate and stately step made closer approach to the speaker. But from a certain nameless awe with which the mad assumptions of the mummer had inspired the whole party, there were found none who put forth hand to seize him, so that, unimpeded, he passed within a yard of the prince's person, and, while the vast assembly, as if with one impulse, shrank from the centres of the rooms to the walls, he made his way uninterruptedly, but with the same solemn and measured step which had distinguished him from the first, through the blue chamber to the purple, through the purple to the green, through the green to the orange, through this again to the white, and even thence to the violet, ere a decided movement had been made to arrest him. It was then, however, that the Prince Prospero, maddening with rage and the shame of his own momentary cowardice, rushed hurriedly through the 6 chambers, while none followed him on account of a deadly terror that had seized upon all. He bore aloft a drawn dagger, and had approached in rapid impetuosity to within 3 or 4 feet of the retreating figure, when the latter, having attained the extremity of the velvet apartment, turned suddenly and confronted his pursuer. There was a sharp cry, and the dagger dropped gleaming upon the sable carpet, upon which instantly afterwards fell prostrate in death the Prince Prospero. Then, summoning the wild courage of despair, a throng of the revellers at once threw themselves into the black apartment, and, seizing the mummer, whose tall figure stood erect and motionless within the shadow of the ebony clock, gasped in unutterable horror at finding the grave cerements and corpse-like mask which they handled with so violent a rudeness, untenanted by any tangible form. And now was acknowledged the presence of the Red Death. He had become like a thief in the night, and one by one dropped the revellers in the blood-bedewed halls of their revel, and died each in the despairing posture of his fall, and the life of the ebony clock went out with that of the last of the gay, and the flames of the tripods expired, and darkness and decay and the Red Death held illimitable dominion over all. The end. Very funny, Dr. Fell. Alright, pause this. I think I might do one more story. Thank you, thank you. Let's have a look. Thank you very much, Bogart fan. Thank you for coming. Cheers to you too. Ha ha ha, pecan head. Thank you, Aaron. If you excuse me, I'm just gonna have some water. I'm back. No problem, Walter. Thank you so much for listening. You take care. I'm glad you like it as well, Rabid Mouse. Right, let me see. Sorry everyone, I'm just looking for one last story I can read to all of you. Oh no, we won't be talking politics on here. I'll have to edit the rules automated message. Some of it is cut out. Oh no, we're not talking that on here. No. Go away, nobody cares. Right. Sorry about that. I ended up sneezing. This one's awfully too long. Any more stories you recommend for me, Dr. Fell? I'm a bit stuck. It's all right, Aaron. They're just playing around, not in a horrible way, but if it does go too far, I will let them know. Thank you, Dr. Fowl. Being more than cheeky. But no, you are doing an excellent job, Aaron. Excuse me, sorry. You're welcome. Sorry, I didn't realise I still had myself on mute. Thank you, Dr. Fowl, with this. The Dune, Stephen King. Being able to read obituaries in advance gives a man an extraordinary sense of power. As the judge climbs into the kayak beneath the bright morning sky, a slow and clumsy process that takes him almost 5 minutes, he reflects that an old man's body is nothing but a sack filled with aches and indignities. "80 years ago, when he was 10, he jumped into a wooden canoe and cast off, with no bulky life jacket, no worries, and certainly with no pee dribbling into his underwear." Okay, this one's different. Every trip out to the little unnamed island began with a great and uneasy excitement. Now there is only unease and pain that seems centered deep in his guts and radiates everywhere. But he still makes the trip. Many things have lost their allure in these shadowy later years. Most things really, but not the dune on the far side of the island. Never the dune. In the early days of his exploration, he expected the dune to be gone after every big storm, and following the 1944 hurricane that sank the USS Raleigh off Siesta Key, he was sure it would be. But when the skies cleared, the island was still there. So was the dune, although the 100-mile-an-hour winds should have blown all the sand away, leaving only the bare rocks. Over the years, he has debated back and forth about whether the magic is in him or in the dune. Perhaps it's both, but surely most of it is in the dune. Oh, hi Scambait Nonsense. Thank you for joining. Since 1932, he has crossed this short stretch of water thousands of times. Usually there's nothing but rocks and bushes and sand. Sometimes there is something else. Settled in the kayak at last, he paddles slowly from the beach to the island, his frizz of white hair blowing around his mostly bald skull. A few turkey buzzards wheel overhead, making their ugly conversation. Once he was the son of the richest man on the Florida Gulf Coast. Then he was a lawyer. Then he was a judge on the Pinellas County Circuit. Then he was appointed to the state Supreme Court. There was talk, during the Reagan years, of a nomination to the United States Supreme Court, but that never happened. And a week after the idiot Clinton became president, Judge Harvey Beecher, just judge to his many acquaintances, he has no real friends, in Sarasota, Osprey, Nokomis and Venice, retired. Hell, he never liked Tallahassee anyway, it's cold up there. Also, it's too far from the island and its peculiar dune. On these early morning kayak trips, paddling the short distance on smooth water, he's willing to admit that he's addicted to it. But who wouldn't be addicted to a thing like this? On the rocky east side, a gnarled bush juts from the split in a guano-splattered rock. This is where he ties up, and he's always careful with the knot. I wouldn't do to be stranded out here. It wouldn't do to be stranded out here. His father's estate, that's how he still thinks of it, although the elder Beecher has been gone for 40 years now, covers almost 2 miles of prime Gulffront property. The main house is fair inland, on the Sarasota Bay side, and there would be no one to hear him yelling. Tommy Curtis, the caretaker, might notice him gone and come looking. More likely, he would just assume the judge was locked up in his study, where he often spends whole days supposedly working on his memoirs. Once upon a time, Mrs. Riley might have become nervous if he didn't come out of the study for lunch. But now he hardly ever eats at noon. She calls him nothing but a stuffed string, but never to his face. There's no other staff, and both Curtis and Riley know he can be cross when he's interrupted. Not that there's really much to interrupt. He hasn't added so much as a line to the memoirs in 2 years, and in his heart he knows they will never be finished. The unfinished recollections of a Florida judge, no great loss there. The one story he could write is the one he never will. The judge wants no talk at his funeral about how in his last years a previously fine intellect was corrupted by senility. No, senility. Oh, that's fine. Whatever. Anyway, he's even slower getting out of the kayak than he was getting in, and turns turtle once, wetting his shirt and trousers in the little waves that run up the gravelly shingle. Beecher is not discommoded. It isn't the first time he's fallen, and there's no one to see him. He supposes it's unwise to continue these trips at his age, even though the island is so close to the mainland, but stopping isn't an option. An addict is an addict is an addict. Beecher struggles to his feet and clutches his belly until the last of the pain subsides. He brushes sand and shells from his trousers, double checks his mooring rope, then spots one of the turkey buzzards perched on the island's largest rock, peering down at him. "Hi," he shouts in the voice he now hates, cracked and wavering, the voice of a fishwife. "Hi, you bugger, get on about your business." After a brief rustle of its raggedy wings, the turkey buzzard sits right where it is. Its beady eyes seem to say, "But Judge, today you are my business." Beecher stoops, picks up a larger shell and shies it at the bird. This time it does fly away, the sound of its wings like rippling cloth. It soars across the short stretch of the water and lands on his dock. Still, the judge thinks, a bad omen. He remembers a fellow on the Florida State Patrol telling him once that turkey buzzards didn't just know where carrion was, they also knew where carrion would be. "I can't tell you," the patrolman said, "how many times I've seen those ugly, I don't know whether to say, bastards circling." It's fine, it's not a kid-friendly stream anyway. "How many times I've seen those ugly bastards circling a spot on the Tamiami where there's a fatal wreck a day or two later." Sounds crazy, I know, but just about any Florida road cop will tell you the same. There are almost always turkey buzzards out there on the little no-name island. He supposes it smells like death to them, and why not? What else? The judge sets off on the little path he has beaten over the years. He will check the dune on the other side, where the sand is beach fine instead of stony and shelly, and then he would return to the kayak and drink his little jug of cold tea. He may doze a while in the morning sun. He dozes often these days, supposes most nonagenarians do, and when he wakes, if he wakes, he'll make the return trip. He tells himself that the dune will be just a smooth, blank upslope of sand, as it is most days, but he knows better. The damned buzzard knew better too. He spends a long time on the sandy side, with his age-warped fingers clasped in a knot behind him. His back aches, his shoulders ache, his hips ache, his knees ache, most of all his gut aches. But he pays these things no mind, perhaps later, but not now. He looks at the dune and what is written there. Anthony Wayland arrives at Beecher's Pelican Point estate bang on 7 p.m, just as promised. One thing the judge has always appreciated, both in the courtroom and out of it, is punctuality, and the boy is punctual. He reminds himself never to call Wayland boy to his face, although this being the South, son is okay. Wayland wouldn't understand that when you're 90 and any fellow under the age of 40 looks like a boy. "Thank you for coming," the judge says, ushering Wayland into his study. It's just the two of them. Curtis and Mrs. Riley have long since gone to their homes in Nokomis village. "You brought the necessary document?" "Yes, indeed, Judge," Wayland says. He opens his attorney's briefcase and removes a thick document bound by a large steel clip. The pages aren't vellum, as they would have been in the old days, but they are rich and heavy just the same. At the top of the first, in forbidding Gothic type, what the judge has always thought of as a graveyard type are the words last will and testament of Harvey L. Beecher. You know, I'm kind of surprised you didn't draft this document yourself. You've probably forgotten more Florida probate law than I've ever learned. That might be true, the judge says in his driest tone. At my age, folks tend to forget a great deal. Wayland flushes to the roots of his hair. I didn't mean... I know what you mean, son, the judge says. No offence taken, not a mite. But since you ask, you know that old saying about how a man who serves as his own lawyer has a fool for a client? Wayland grins. Heard it and used it plenty of times when I'm wearing my public defender hat and some sad sack wife abuser or hit and runner tells me he's going to go to the DIY route in court. I'm sure ye have, but here's the other half. A lawyer who serves as his own lawyer has a great fool for a client, goes for criminal, civil and probate law. So, shall we get down to business? Time is short. This is something he means in more ways than one. They get down to business. Mrs. Riley has left decaf coffee, which Wayland rejects in favour of a Coca-Cola. He makes copious notes as the judge dictates the changes in his dry courtroom voice, adjusting old bequests and adding new ones. The major new one, $4 million, is to the Sarasota County Beach and Wildlife Preservation Society. In order to qualify, they must successfully petition the state legislature to have a certain island just off the coast of the Pelican Point declared forever wild. They won't have a problem getting that done, the judge says. You can handle the legal for them yourself. I prefer pro bono, but of course that's up to you. One trip to Tallahassee should do it. It's a little spit of a thing, nothing growing there but a few bushes. Governor Scott and his Tea Party cronies will be delighted. Why is that, Judge? Because the next time Beach and Preservation comes to them, begging money, they can say, didn't old Judge Beecher just give you $4 million? Get out of here, and don't let the door hit you in the ass on your way out. Wayland agrees that this is probably just how it will go. Scott and his friends are all forgiving if they're not the ones doing it. And the two men move on to the smaller bequests. Once I get a clean draft, we'll need 2 witnesses and a notary, Wayland says when they've finished. I'll get all that done with this draft here, just to be safe, the judge says. If anything happens to me in the interim, it should stand up. There's no one to contest it. I've outlived them all. A wise precaution, Judge. It would be good to take care of it tonight. I don't suppose your caretaker and housekeeper won't be back until 8 tomorrow, Beecher says. But I'll make it the first order of business. Harry Staines and Vamo Rhodes a notary, and he'll be glad to come over before he goes into his office. He owes me a favour or 6. You give that document to me, son. I'll lock it in my safe. I ought to at least make a... Wayland looks at the gnarled, outstretched hand and trails off. When a state Supreme Court judge, even a retired one, holds out his hand, demurrals must cease. What the hell? It's only an annotated draft, anyway, soon to be replaced by a clean version. He passes the unsigned will over and watches Beecher rises, painfully, and swings a picture of Florida Everglades out on a hidden hinge. The judge enters the correct combination, making no attempt to hide the touchpad from view, and deposits the will on top of what looks to Wayland like a large and untidy heap of cash. Yikes. There, Beecher says. All done and buttoned up, except for the signing part, that is. How about a drink to celebrate? I have some fine single malt scotch. Well, I guess one wouldn't hurt. It never hurt me when I was your age, although it does now, so you'll have to pardon me for not joining you. Decaf coffee and a little sweet tea are the strongest drinks I take these days. Ice? Wayland holds up 2 fingers and Beecher adds 2 cubes to the drink with the slow ceremony of old age. Wayland takes a sip and high colour immediately dashes into his cheeks. It is the flush, Judge Beecher thinks, of a man who enjoys his tipple. As Wayland sets his glass down, he says, "Do you mind if I ask what the hurry is? You're right, I take it." The judge doubts if young Wayland takes it that way at all. He's not blind. "A country fair," he says, seesawing one hand in the air and sitting down with a grunt and a wince. Then, after consideration, he says, "Do you really want to know what the hurry is?" Wayland considers the question, and Beecher likes him for that. Then he nods. "It has to do with that island we took care of just now. Probably never even noticed it, have you?" "Can't say that I have." Most people don't. It barely sticks out of the water. The sea turtles don't even bother with that old island. Yet it's special. "Did you know my grandfather fought in the Spanish-American War?" "No, sir, I did not." Wayland speaks with exaggerated respect, and Beecher knows the boy believes his mind is wandering. The boy is wrong. Beecher's mind has never been clearer, and now that he's begun, he finds that he wants to tell this story at least once before. Well, before. Yes, there's a photograph of him standing on top of San Juan Hill. It's around here someplace. Grampy claimed to have fought in the Civil War as well, but my research, for my memoirs you understand, proved conclusively that he couldn't have. He would have been a mere child, if born at all, but he was quite the fanciful gentleman, and he had a way of making me believe the wildest tales. Why would I not? I was only a child, not long from believing in Kris Kringle and the Tooth Fairy. Was he a lawyer like you and your father? No, son, he was a thief. The original Lightfinger Harry. Anything that wasn't nailed down. Only like most thieves who don't get caught. Our current governor might be a case in point. He calls himself a businessman. His chief business and chief thievery was land. He bought bug and gator infested Florida acreage cheap and sold it dear to folks who must have been as gullible as I was a child. As I was as a child. Balzac once said, "Behind every great fortune there is a great crime." That's certainly true for the Beecher family, and please remember that you're my lawyer. Anything I say to you must be held in confidence. Yes, Judge. Wayland takes another sip of his drink. It is by far the finest scotch he has ever drunk. Grampy Beecher was the one who pointed that island out to me. I was 10. He had care of me for the day. And I suppose he wanted some peace and quiet, or maybe what he wanted was a bit noisier. There was a pretty housemaid, and he may have been in hopes of investigating beneath her petticoats. So he told me that Edward Teach, better known as Blackbeard, had supposedly buried a great treasure out there. Nobody's ever found it, Havy, he said. Havy's what he called me, but you might be the one. A fortune in jewels and gold doubloons. You'll know what I did next. I suppose you went out there and left your grandfather to cheer up the maid. The judge nods, smiling. I took the old wooden canoe we had tied up to the dock. Went like my hair was on fire and my tail feathers were catching. Didn't take but 5 minutes to paddle out there. Takes me 3 times as long these days. and that's if the water's smooth. The island's all rock and brush on the landward side, but there's a dune of fine beach sand on the Gulf side. It never goes away. In the 80 years I've been going out there, it never seems to change, at least not geographically. Didn't find any treasure, I suppose. I did in a way, but it wasn't jewels and gold. It was a name written in the sand of that dune, as if with a stick, you know, only I didn't see any stick. The letters were drawn deep, and the sun struck shadows into them, making them stand out, almost as if they were floating. What was the name, Judge? I think you have to see it written to understand. The judge takes a sheet of paper from the top drawer of his desk, prints carefully, then turns the paper around to Wayland to read it. Roby Ladouche. All right, Wayland says cautiously. On any other day I would have gone treasure hunting with this very boy because he was my best friend, and you know how boys are when they're best friends. Joined at the hip, Wayland says, smiling. Tight as a new key in a new lock, Wayland agrees, but it was summer and he'd gone off with his parents to visit his mama's people in Virginia or Maryland or some such northern clime. So I was on my own. But attend me closely, Counsellor. The boy's actual name was Robert Ladoucette. Again, Wayland says, all right. The judge thinks that sort of leading drawl could become annoying over time, but it isn't a thing he'll ever have to actually find out, so he lets it go. He was my best friend, and I was his, but there was a whole gang of boys we ran around with, and everyone called him Robbie Ladouche. You follow? I guess, Wayland says, but the judge can see he doesn't. That's understandable. Beecher has had more time to think about these things, often on sleepless nights. Remember that I was 10. If I had been asked to spell my friend's nickname, I would have spelled it just this way. He taps Roby Ladouche. Speaking almost to himself, he adds, so some of the magic comes from me. It must come from me. The question is, how much? You're saying you didn't write that name in the sand? No, I thought I made that clear. One of your other friends, then? They were all from Nokomis village, and didn't even know about that island. We never would have paddled out to such an uninteresting little rock on our own. Robbie knew it was there. He was also from the point, but he was hundreds of miles north. All right. My chum Robbie never came back from that vacation. We got word a week or so later that he'd taken a fall while out horseback riding. He broke his neck, killed instantly. His parents were heartbroken. So was I, of course. There was silence while Wayland considers this. While they both consider it, somewhere far off, a helicopter beats at the sky over the Gulf. The DEA looking for drug runners. The judge supposes. He hears them every night. It's the modern age, and in some ways, in many, he'll be glad to be shed of it. At last, Wayland says, are you saying what I think you're saying? Well, I don't know, the judge says. What do you think I'm saying? But Anthony Wayland is a lawyer, and refusing to be drawn in is an ingrained habit with him. Did you tell your grandfather? On the day the telegram about Robbie came, he wasn't there to tell. He never stayed in one place for long. We didn't see him again for 6 months or more. No, I kept it to myself. And like Mary after she gave birth to Jesus, I considered these things in my heart. And what conclusion did you draw? I kept canoeing out to that island to look at the dune, and that should answer your question. There was nothing, and nothing, and nothing. I guess I was on the verge of forgetting all about it, but then I went out one afternoon after school, and there was another name written in the sand, printed in the sand, to be courtroom exact. No sign of a stick that time either, although I suppose a stick could have been thrown into the water. this time the name was Peter Alderson. It meant nothing to me until a few days later. It was my chore to go out to the end of the road and get the paper, and it was my habit to scan the front page while I walked back up the drive, which, as you know from driving it yourself, is a good quarter-mile long. In the summer, I'd also check on how the Washington Senators had done, because back then they were as close to a Southern team as we had. This particular day, a headline on the bottom of the front page caught my eye: "Window washer killed in tragic fall." The poor guy was doing the third floor windows of the Sarasota Public Library when the scaffolding he was standing on gave way. His name was Peter Alderson. The judge can see from Wayland's face that he believes this is either a prank or some sort of elaborate fantasy the judge is spinning out. He can also see that Wayland is enjoying his drink, and when the judge moves to top it up, Wayland doesn't say no. And really the young man's belief or disbelief is beside the point. It's just such a luxury to tell it. "Maybe you see why I go back and forth in my mind about where the magic lies," Beecher says. "I knew Robbie, and the misspelling of his name was my misspelling. But I didn't know this window washer from Adam. In any case, that's when the Dune really started to get a hold on me. I began going out every day when I was here, a habit that's continued into my very old age. I respect the place, I fear the place, but most of all, I'm addicted to the place." Over the years, many names have appeared on that dune, and the people the names belong to always die. Sometimes it's within the week, sometimes it's 2, but it's never more than a month. Some have been people I knew, and if it's by nickname, I knew them. It's the nickname I see. One day in 1940, I paddled out there and saw Grampy Beecher drawn into the sand. He died in Key West 3 days later. Heart attack. With the air of someone humouring a man who is mentally unbalanced but not actually dangerous, Wayland asks, "Did you ever try to interfere with this process? Call your grandfather, for instance, and tell him to see a doctor?" Beecher shakes his head. "I didn't know it was a heart attack until we got word from the Monroe County Medical Examiner, did I? It could have been an accident or even a murder. Certainly there were people who had reasons to hate my grandfather. His dealings were not of the purest sort. Still, he was your grandfather and all. The truth, counsellor, is that I was afraid. I still feel, as if there on that island there's a hatch that's come ajar. On this side, what we're pleased to call the real world. On the other is all the machinery of the universe running at top speed. Only a fool would stick his hand into such machinery in an attempt to stop it. Judge Beecher, if you want your paperwork to sail through probate, I'd keep quiet about all this. You might think there's no one to contest your will, but when large amounts of money are at stake, third and fourth cousins have a way of coming out of the woodwork, and you know the criterion, being of sound mind and body. I've kept it to myself for 80 years, Beecher says, and in his voice Wayland can hear objection overruled. Never a word until now, and I'm sure you won't talk. Of course not, Wayland says. I was always excited on days when names appeared in the sand. Unhealthily excited, I'm sure, but terrified of the phenomenon only once. That single time I was deeply terrified, and fled back to the point in my canoe as if devils were after me. Shall I tell you? Please. Wayland lifts his drink and sips. Why not? Billable hours are, after all, billable hours. It was 1959. I was still on the point. I've always lived here except for the years in Tallahassee, and it's better not to speak of them, although I now think part of the hate I felt for that provincial backwater of a town, perhaps even most of it, was simply a masked longing for the island and the dune. I kept wondering what I was missing, you see, who I was missing, Being able to read obituaries in advance gives a man an extraordinary sense of power. Perhaps you find that unlovely. The truth of them is. So, 1959, Harvey Beecher, lawyering in Sarasota and living at Pelican Point. If it wasn't pouring down rain when I got home, I'd always change into old clothes and paddle out to the island for a look-see before supper. On this particular day, I'd been kept at the office late, and by the time I'd gotten out to the island, tied up, and walked over to the dune side, the sun was going down big and red, as it so often does over the Gulf. What I saw stunned me. I literally could not move. Hi Dinky Toy, welcome back. Just a moment everyone, just need to have a sip of water. Okay, I'm back. Oh, hi Ronaldo. Welcome. There wasn't just one name written in the sand that evening, but many, and in fact that red sunset light they looked as if they had been written in blood. They were crammed together, they wove in and out, and they were written over and above and up and down. The whole length and breadth of the dune was covered with a tapestry of names. The ones down by the water had been half erased. Wayland looks awed in spite of his core disbelief. I think I screamed. I can't remember for sure, but yes, I think so. What I do remember is breaking the paralysis and running away as fast as I could down the path to where my canoe was tied up. Just a moment, everyone. Sorry, I had to mute myself. I needed to burp. It seemed to take me forever to unpluck the knot, and when I did, I pushed the canoe out into the water before I climbed in. I was soaked from head to toe, and it's a wonder I didn't tip over. Although in those days I could have easily swum to shore, pushing the canoe ahead of me. Not these days. If I tipped my kayak over now, that would be all, she wrote. Then I suggest you stay on shore, or at least until your will is signed, witnessed and notarized. Judge Beecher gives the young man a wintry smile. You needn't worry about that, son, he says. He looks toward the window and the gulf beyond. His face is long and thoughtful. Those names, I can see them, yet jostling each other for place on that blood-red dune. 2 days later, a TWA plane... What was that? Oh, thank you for subscribing, Miss Ismail Ali. And welcome to the chat as well. Much appreciated. Okay. His face is long and thoughtful. Those names, I can see them yet jostling each other for place on that blood-red dune. 2 days later, a TWA plane on its way to Miami crashed in the glades. All 119 souls on board were killed. The passenger list was in the paper. I recognized some of the names. I recognized many of them. You saw this? You saw those names? Yes, for several months after I stayed away from the island, and I promised myself I would stay away for good. I suppose drug addicts make the same promises to themselves about their dope, don't they? And like them, I eventually weakened and resumed my old habit. Now, counsellor, do you understand why I called you out here to finish the work on my will, and why it had to be tonight? Wayland doesn't believe a word of it, but like many fantasies, this one has its own internal logic. It's easy enough to follow. The judge is 90. His once ruddy complexion has gone the colour of clay. His formerly firm step has become shuffling and tentative. He's clearly in pain, and he's lost weight he can't afford to lose. I suppose that today you saw your name in the sand, Wayland says. Judge Beecher looks momentarily startled and then he smiles. It is a terrible smile, transforming his narrow, pallid face into a death's head grin. Oh no, he says, not mine. The end. And that I'm going to call the end of tonight's storytelling stream, everyone. I thank you so much for coming. I'm glad I have gone back to Streamlabs after OBS would not bring up any of my automated messages in the chat. Oh, you're very welcome. Thank you. I'm glad to know that, Scambait Nonsense. You're very welcome. I thank you all for listening. And please like, share, subscribe to my channel. Make everyone aware where I do these streams, where I do game streaming and also storytelling. I really do thank you all. I'll see some of you tomorrow, and I'll also wish you all a happy Halloween. Just having drinks and finger sandwiches in the parlour following the stream. I might be watching a Halloween movie with my mum, like Hocus Pocus or something. We'll see. Oh, hi, Narthrivan. Oh, I'm so sorry you came late. You can still watch the playback. And thank you for that, Dinky. And disappearing tides. Oh, no. I hope I can see if they're back at all, but I doubt it. Anyway, you take care, everyone. See you all very soon.